Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Among the most significant of post-Cold War developments is the heightened state of tension between China and Japan. This comes at a time rare in history when both countries are recognized as great powers, determined to take their rightful place in the hierarchy of nations. The emergence of China and Japan into this new realm of global prominence involves a search for new identities in both nations that is proving easier to set in motion than it is to control. This is clearly going to be one of the most interesting and important stories of the 21st century, and it's already posing vexing questions for the United States of America. My guest is Michael Yahuda, former fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center and a visiting scholar at the Elliot School for International Affairs at George Washington University. Michael Yahuda, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you, Michael, because you are not only an expert, you work on a book on this very topic. And even though I emphasize the conflict between these two nations, I think your books can also point out that there are areas of potential cooperation between them. But in terms of what conflict now exists between China and Japan, I know there's a very large historic dimension to it, but what accounts for the current tensions in your opinion?
Well, there are two broad issues that are at stake here. One has to do, as you mentioned in your introduction, the fact that since the end of the Cold War, each one has been forging almost independently a new kind of identity, both at home and in terms of foreign affairs. And without really either side intending it to be so, it has had the effect where it has created a sense in their own populations, a sense of hostility towards the other. And now that's one big problem. Mm-hmm. The other is what might be called a geopolitical one, in the sense that here is China rising, and its weight in international affairs is increasing almost daily. Its importance in the region is also growing. Here is Japan, which really coinciding with the end of the Cold War, lost its appeal as an economic model. There was a bursting of the economic bubble in the early 90s, and until that time, the Japanese were feeling fairly comfortable with a kind of a role of being a very important economic power, with a different approach to running the economy than, say, the United States. And indeed, at that time, many in the United States felt Japan was an adversary and an unwelcome one. But then, more or less for the whole of the 90s, Japan economically was in the doldrums. And here was China rising. And the fear in Japan was that somehow Japan would be placed ultimately in some kind of subordinate position.
Right.
And so the Chinese, whose main concern was really the United States, have found, really almost without recognizing it, that they have a problem on their hands with regard to Japan.
Right.
But then there's also, related to their different identities, is the big issue of history.
Exactly, exactly. Michael, that's a splendid explanation. I want to explore both aspects of that, the popular attitudes that have proven somewhat uncontrollable and the geopolitical realities that also are a bit of a puzzle at the moment. A couple of questions that occur to me. One thing, and I hope I'm right on this in terms of my research into it, there is, notwithstanding all of this, an enormous amount of economic trade between these two countries. Am I right in that? Yes. China is actually Japan's largest partner?
Yes, it is. The trade between China and Japan surpassed that of either's relation with the United States back about 2 years ago in 2005. And so that China is now Japan's most important economic partner, and Japan is China's most important economic partner, except for the EU.
I see.
But the EU, one has to understand, is now a conglomerate of 27 countries. So Japan, on the other hand, is a single state, and so in many ways it figures more significantly.
Right.
And in addition to the economic relations, Japan is a major investor in China.
Right.
There are more than 300 cities in both countries which have kind of what they call sisterly relationships. The Japanese account for 2/3 of the foreign students in Japan, numbering about 85,000, 86,000, something like that. And there are 20,000 Japanese students in China who are the second largest foreign community there, second to the South Koreans.
Interesting. So whatever degree of rivalry exists, excuse me, sits on a very strong foundation of interdependence economically.
Yes, and indeed, from the point of view of many people, the conflict between them seems almost an anomaly, because the normal expectation is, if you have such close economic relationships, if you also have close social relationships, you would expect that there would be some better understanding.
Right.
You would expect that there would be important constituencies in each country which would argue for maintaining good relations. For example, here in the United States, until fairly recently, the business community has been a powerful constituency for having good relations with China. And to a certain extent you can see that in Japan, and possibly a little bit in China, but nothing that is decisive.
Let me risk a non-expert's wager on this, Michael, because you're quite right. You know, if you look at it on the surface with the power of the two nations, this extraordinary interdependence that you've just presented for us, you know, you would say, well, why do we have this tension? Could it be, and this is just my, I guess perhaps, what we might call the stakes of the game? I mean, the question of the leadership of Asia, and perhaps this wider leadership role in the world is so important that in itself would prompt them to have this kind of conflict. And I think one of the reasons that occurs to me is that if perhaps the context of the, quote, Asian leadership issue involves other players as well. I mean, I'm thinking of India, for example, as a nation of power, size, and might. It's making its progress known today. Russia still has a major stake in this. So is it the context, perhaps, of Asian leadership that builds this?
Well, the context is there, but the peculiar issue is that neither side really openly addresses this major problem. So a great deal of it tends to be subsumed under the notion of history, in the sense that the Chinese, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, have emphasized in their teaching in schools, in what they call the patriotic education, that the main claim, historical claim of the Communist Party for legitimacy is the victory over Japan in the war, in the Pacific War that finished in 1945. And the argument is that the Japanese were the last and the most cruel of the invaders of China in the previous 100 years or so. And the argument is that the Japanese won't acknowledge that, at least won't acknowledge it to the satisfaction of the Chinese side. And the Chinese have, in a sense, and it's only a very recent development really, because in Mao's time, the claim for legitimacy was based on victory over the Civil War.
Right, exactly.
Over Chiang Kai-shek.
Exactly.
But since the Chinese in the early 80s began to appeal to the nationalists who were in Taiwan to unite with them peacefully,
they dropped the prior argument.
They've dropped that argument. Also, of course, since the death of Mao, they've dropped the notion of class struggle.
Right.
So the only thing that unifies the country is the sense of patriotism or nationalism.
And that runs directly, and I think even as a non-expert know this, it runs directly counter to the Japanese notion about that, don't they? I mean, because there's been this, we're all reading about the Japanese stubbornness, if you will, in terms of, in the minds of many, acknowledging or apologizing for their activities in World War II.
Well, the Japanese say that they have apologized to the Chinese more than 20 or 30 times. at fairly senior levels. And the emperor has visited China and also apologized. And so it's developed in the Japanese view that however many times they apologize, it's never enough. And there's the suspicion that in some senses the Chinese leadership have been using the issue of apology for ulterior reasons. Meanwhile, as far as the Japanese are concerned, the argument is that the Chinese have paid hardly any attention whatsoever to the fact that since 1945, the Japanese have really been subject to their constitution, which emphasizes Japan as a peaceful nation. And
wouldn't they also argue that since 1945, through their overseas development assistance, they've been major supporters of China?
That's right. And that, in fact, Japan, as seen by the world as a whole, is really as an economic power, not as a military power. And therefore, the Japanese feel the Chinese are neglecting all of that side of it. Meanwhile, the Japanese, especially following the end of the Cold War and the collapse, if you like, of their economic model, have been searching for new ways to be proud of their country.
Exactly.
So it's in 1993 that they first put forward the idea of becoming a permanent member of the Security Council.
And I want to focus on that point because, to my mind, the Japanese interest in becoming a member of the Security Council and the UN and playing a larger role in the world speaks very much to their idea of what their new greatness might be in the world. And I want to contrast that a bit with the Chinese. Before we get to that, though, Michael, let me ask you this question about what you just said. The way these attitudes have worked out, this may be too clever by half, but I'm wondering to what extent there's an interesting generational twist to this. For example, it seems to me that as the Chinese made their argument about the new legitimacy, if you will, resting on World War II, defeat of the Japanese, that proved particularly attractive to and salient with youth, Chinese youth. And they may have taken it perhaps even with more enthusiasm than leadership intended. Whereas on the other side, what we might call the Japanese insistence that they've apologized enough and let's get away from this, and there's, our record shouldn't be that shameful to us, might reflect the older generation of Japan. In other words, you might have these kind of counter forces sort of heating up the argument on either side. Does that make any sense at all?
Well, yes, the change of generations is very important. Interestingly enough, the generation that actually suffered from the Japanese didn't really make a great deal of fuss about it afterwards.
Right.
It's the younger generation who are doing it. And then on the Japanese side, for some time, the older generation, or at least the immediate leaders at the end of the war, were people who had, to some extent, participated in at least the governance of occupied China. And they felt some degree of guilt. Also, being traditionally minded, they had a high view of Chinese culture.
Right.
Whereas the newer generation doesn't have that sense of guilt, doesn't have personal ties, and at the same time doesn't have such a high view of Chinese culture because they saw China in the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
And so from their point of view, Japan is very advanced and China is not. And so there is a disconnect here, especially as the Japanese for some years, or Japanese leaders now for some years, have been trying to inculcate some pride in being Japanese.
Exactly.
So they've had in their schools, for example, displays of the flag and the singing of the national anthem at the beginning of the day. Now, in America, this is regarded as the norm. Right. This is not necessarily the norm in other countries. And so its introduction into Japan is seen, therefore, on the Chinese side, especially by the young Chinese, as portending a Japan that hasn't come to terms with its past and therefore is in some sense a potential great danger again.
That's very helpful, and I want to use that as a springboard, if you will, for this next question, because and you alluded to this a moment ago when you mentioned Japan's interest in the Security Council seat. How would you contrast the future strategies of these two countries in the sense of what they might mean by further greatness, to try to hone that question. When you, and I've read this too, that Japan has this very strong interest in a Security Council seat, feels that China might even want to frustrate that wish of theirs. It led me to think that Japan sees its role, it's a powerful country but a small insular nation, as more of a broker, if you will, in world of affairs, whereas China as a continent-sized nation may see its future greatness as being a rival or even supplanting the United States. I mean, do the notions of greatness, looking toward the future, are they in strong conflict as well?
Well, these are things that have not really been articulated greatly by either side. Certainly not by the Chinese. There's a sense in China that China used to be the great center of civilization in the world.
Right.
That really looked on all those within reach as in some senses inferior and perhaps even subordinate to China. And they feel that the Western powers, beginning with the Opium War in 1840, have really downtrodden China, pushed it down, oppressed it, humiliated it, and now China is resurgent again. It wants to be a great power. It doesn't want to be second to anybody.
Exactly.
But what does that mean in practice has not really been explained. The Chinese leaders seem to be ambivalent about it. On the one hand, they go out of their way to treat every tiny little country as if it were the equal of China, which they do in sort of diplomacy and so on. But everybody knows that that's not the case. And China has also developed what they call big country or big power diplomacy as well. And as far as China is concerned, it still is not fully unified because of not having Taiwan.
Exactly.
And who is it who is stopping China from getting Taiwan? It's the United States. Who is the big power in world affairs that can in some way limit China's growth? It's the United States. On the other hand, it is the United States that also facilitates China's growth. So there's ambivalence.
And it's the United States that's had this cooperative arrangement with Japan too for decades.
But from a Chinese point of view, there is a sense in which they want to be greater than they are. They haven't completed their mission, which is really an internal one, of transforming their country into a wealthy country.
Right.
Now, that in itself will obviously change the distribution of power in the region and in the world. And we don't know really what that will mean to Chinese or to others. And we're already seeing the effects of China's interest in getting supplies of energy and other resources throughout the world.
Right.
And that imprint is going to grow rather than diminish. So about the end results, we don't know.
I'm glad you mentioned that point of China's interest in getting its resources and other contacts around the world. It's very visible in Africa and South America these days, and bound to extend. I want to be scrupulously fair to the book you're writing, Michael, and your academic interests, because we've talked a lot about conflict, but you're also going to be focusing on at least potential cooperation. And even briefly, if you were going to state where that might be and what it might be, I'd love to hear it. And I'm wondering if it might have to do with security arrangements in Southeast Asia.
Well, the things that they have, the two leaders, two sets of leaders have recognized that they can't allow the conflict between them to deepen and to lead to major incidents, because they have disputes over ownership of islands at sea, where to draw the median line at sea for resources under the sea between them, and so on. And so the two sets of leaders in the last year have agreed to have continual sets of meetings and so on. And there are promising areas for cooperation here, which does have strategic significance. For example, the Japanese are very advanced in using energy efficiently.
Right.
And this is a very important issue for the Chinese, and it has strategic significance for them because of their inordinate use of energy and huge demands for it. Secondly, the Japanese can help the Chinese tackle pollution, which is an enormous problem.
Indeed,
in China.
I think everyone's hearing about that now.
And also can help them in terms of water conservancy projects. And so there's a whole range of things which, although are not high up in military terms. They have acquired strategic significance.
Well, they seem extremely important to me. I mean, I think everyone listening and watching us as well, because you're talking about strategic and technological matters that China very, very much needs, almost desperately needs Japan can furnish. So that recognition may mitigate the tensions.
Where there is a problem is the larger issues we were talking about earlier, about the sense of China growing, Japan growing, in addition to which, of course, Japan has been helping the United States in the war on terror by providing, if you like, rear services support.
Right.
And this involves sending naval ships way off into the Indian Ocean. In other words, it seems as if Japan is developing a kind of a global reach in military affairs. Obviously closely tied to the United States, but seen from China, this is an unwelcome element, because from a Chinese point of view, the alliance that Japan has with America, with America, has the effect of preventing Japan from becoming a fully fledged military power.
I am so glad that you have, and I appreciate every aspect of that answer, but you introduced the United States at this point in our conversation, and this is just what I wanted to bring us to. Because as I suggested in the introduction, everything that you've mentioned, Michael, and particularly this last focus on security issues worldwide, brings up the question of how the man in the middle, so to speak, the United States, is going to relate to both these powers. Now, you have, and things I've heard you say and write, suggested a, if I got it right, trilateral approach. Now, what is that? How would that work, and what are its prospects?
Well, in the United States at the moment seems to have separate relations with Japan and with China. And at the moment, the administration is very pleased with the way each relationship is developing. However, as seen by China and Japan, there are potentially disquieting aspects of this. First of all, the Chinese fear that Japan and the United States may somehow work together to constrain China. And therefore, any kind of military deployments that the Japanese have, or in developing some kind of missile defense system against the North Koreans, has implications for China. Then, as far as the Japanese are concerned, they note the range and depth of the relationship developing between China and the United States. And they fear that at some point, the United States and China may feel that they have to establish some kind of condominium for the area, which would subordinate Japan.
Well, I'm glad, given these corresponding sets of fears, and they sound both actually quite rational and also quite powerful, how can the United States then position itself?
It seems to me that the United States should recognize that underlying the two good relationships it has, there are sources of instability. And it would be better for the United States to address these earlier rather than later. And one of the ways it can do so is by establishing a strategic dialogue, if you like, at a high level on a regular basis involving Chinese, Japanese, and Americans, in which they discuss, if you like, their views of the long term as well as immediate developments. Like we have a precedent for this, if you like, on the bilateral level at the moment between the United States and China, which both sides seem to be satisfied with. And now for the Japanese, it would mean that the Chinese would have to become a bit more transparent about their military. It would mean that the Chinese side would have to recognize that the weapons systems that the United States is making available to Japan are not directed against China. And this involves, again, transparency involves dialogue at a high level. And given the fact that as far as the United States is concerned, the United States has no real territorial demands on either. The United States on the whole is quite satisfied with the status quo. And the United States' main interests are really sort of commercial and strategic stability.
Right.
And this it would be better developed with the cooperation of both together, rather than trying to do it on a separate basis.
As you explain that, and again, I find that a very, to me, very coherent explanation, I'm also getting this sense, it's a question of timing, that if the United States chooses to endorse a strategy like this is the perfect time to do it, because things have not come to a head. The United States is seen perhaps as equally desirable in a partnership by both, for whatever reasons they may have. But that if this does not get underway fairly soon, the opportunity may have passed.
I think that's right, because the people who have, if you like, taken the risk of seeking to improve cooperation between the two sides are the current two sets of leaders. Now, the Japanese Prime Minister is facing elections very soon.
Right.
And at least on current indications, he may not do so well.
Right.
And so we may end up with a different Prime Minister who may not necessarily have invested the same personal political capital in this. And the same applies on the Chinese side.
That's an excellent point on which to end this conversation and look forward to the next, because we have an opportunity, and you've helped us see us, Michael, and I appreciate that very much. I want you to come back when the book is finished, and let's take it up then.
I'd very much like to. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the exchange.
So did I. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. And thank you, Michael. It was thoroughly delightful. And